Welcome to the new session on modern Western philosophy, Phenomenology. Introduction. The literal meaning of the word phenomenology is knowledge of phenomenon. It derives from the following two words, phenomenon plus logos. Phenomenon means any experience that a conscious being has about its surroundings and situations of life. Logos means study, knowledge or science. Thus, phenomenology is the study of phenomenon. Here, conscious being is a human being. A human being obtains different experiences of the world in which he or she is situated as a living organism. This idea can be translated into the following philosophical language. Human being as a conscious being is a subject that contacts with the experiences of the world. This experience is about an object. Thus, in its basic sense, phenomenology is the study of the subject-object relation. Human being as a conscious subject acquires the knowledge of the object. How does the conscious subject know the object? This is the primary question of phenomenology. As a philosophical attempt, thus at the outset itself, phenomenology proposes the following idea. If philosophy is the knowledge of what is, it must pursue its goal by the reflection on how the knowledge about object is constituted by a subject. The word constitution is an important one in phenomenology. We shall come to it later as we proceed further into the details of phenomenology. Edmund Husserl, one of the prominent German thinkers of 20th century, is the chief proponent of phenomenology. Though important developments of phenomenology can be found in the philosophical works of Immanuel Kant, George W. F. Hegel, Ernest Mach and Franz Brentano, phenomenology as a new way of doing the philosophy of subject-object relation was first formally announced by Edmund Husserl. But still, we should remember that the phenomenological movement, understood in its broadest terms, includes not just the work of Edmund Husserl, but also the works of many original practitioners of phenomenology who did not adhere to Husserl's approach to phenomenology, the most prominent of whom was Martin Heidegger. We should also remember that the philosophers who moved with the practice of phenomenology are extraordinarily diverse in their interest. For example, in their interpretations of the central issues of phenomenology, in their applications of what they understood to be the phenomenological method, and in their development of what they took to be the phenomenological program for the future of philosophy. Famous French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, therefore, has rightly remarked that phenomenology is a story of the deviations from Husserl's phenomenology. The history of phenomenology is the history of Husserlian heresies. Martin Heidegger's turn from Edmund Husserl. Martin Heidegger was a student of Edmund Husserl. He thoroughly studied Husserl's work on phenomenology, especially Husserl's famous work Logical Investigations. He carefully examined Husserl's central themes of phenomenology. They are intentionality, its structure, the constitution of object and the method of reduction. Before we turn our attention to Heidegger's basic explanation about phenomenology, it would be appropriate to see the central phenomenological theme in Husserl. A note on Husserl's phenomenology. The central theme in Husserl's phenomenology is intentionality. This notion is related to the nature of consciousness. As we all know, consciousness is an ever-changing stream. Still, it maintains a kind of apparent unity within this perpetual flux. Husserl concentrates on this characteristic of consciousness. For Husserl, consciousness is the basis of all human experience. He deals with the appearances of experiences in consciousness. His viewpoint regarding consciousness as the basis of all experience should be grasped in a different way from that of the view of idealism. What is idealism? Generally speaking, idealism is the position that reality is ideas, thought, mind or cells rather than material forces. There may be a single or absolute mind or plurality of minds. In short, idealism stresses the mental or spiritual aspects of experience. In Husserl's view, experiences of consciousness about the world are not ideas. Then, are the experiences about the world a representation of the objects of the world in Husserl's phenomenology? The answer is no. It is to be noted that from the beginning of his philosophical career, he was against the philosophical positions adopted by naturalism too. What is naturalism? It is a philosophical position in which nature is accepted as the whole of reality. Naturalists interpret nature in different ways. Generally speaking, naturalists hold that universe is self-sufficient without supernatural cause or control, and that in all probability the interpretation of the world given by the sciences is the only satisfactory explanation of reality. The philosophical position held by Husserl with reference to consciousness and objectivity, therefore, should be called as phenomenological, distinct from the positions taken by naturalism and idealism. According to him, the experiences of the world as objects appear to consciousness as they are experienced. Here, we should carefully understand that Husserl never denies the reality of the world. He simply states that the world is accessible to us only as appearances or phenomena in consciousness. German thinker Immanuel Kant also talked about phenomena. To him, a phenomenon is the experience of object accessible to the categories of understanding. He also talked about noumena, which can be translated as things in themselves. According to Kant, categories of understanding can never get noumena. Husserl is not worried about this Kantian division of reality. To him, world is reality that appears to consciousness as phenomena. Now, let us make a hasty look at the Husserlian notion of intentionality. Intentionality. Husserl's interest in intentionality was inspired by his teacher Franz Brentano. However, there are differences between Husserl's idea of this notion and that of Franz Brentano. We do not go into the details of those differences, but rather highlight only Husserl's views about intentionality. On a basic level, Husserlian phenomenology means a study of appearances. An appearance, in phenomenological terms, is not simply disorganized sense data or an undetermined object of experience. For phenomenology, any object which appears is already in a relationship to consciousness. The appearance of an object has no meaning outside of this relationship. Thus, one can characterize an appearance as anything that shows itself for consciousness. Husserlian phenomenology thus starts with the analysis of the appearances that show themselves for consciousness. It can be said that Husserl's phenomenology is a study of the intentional correlation of acts of consciousness with their objects, and that it studies the ways in which different kinds of objects involve different kinds of correlation with different kinds of acts. For Husserl, consciousness is always consciousness of something, or better, consciousness is always as if of an object. What matter is not whether or not there is an object, but what the features are of consciousness that makes it always be as if of an object. These three words, as if, of, are the key to understand Husserl's notion of intentionality. In Husserl's view, intentionality means that consciousness in a certain way brings it about that there are objects. Consciousness is always directed to objects. By the usage bringing about, Husserl does not mean that we create or cause the world and its objects. It simply means that consciousness constitutes objects. The word constitution is a key notion in Husserlian phenomenology to understand the depth of the concept intentionality. Constitution is the act whereby an object becomes meaningful to the subject in the process of the directness of consciousness. The presence of objects becomes meaningful only through the flow and structure of consciousness. The world can have no meaning apart from consciousness, just as consciousness can have no meaning apart from the world. Things appear only in the manner in which consciousness experiences them, but they are experienced only in so far as they are present for consciousness. The unfolding of this reciprocity in which objectivity is achieved is the phenomenological meaning of constitution. This reciprocity is important because we never simply perceive objects. Our experience is considerably more complex. As well as direct perception, any experience can potentially involve different modes such as expectation, memory or imagination. This is to say that from the phenomenological point of view, the description of experience is concerned as much with absence as it is with presence. Martin Heidegger and hermeneutic phenomenology. Martin Heidegger is one of the most original and important philosophers of the 20th century. His thinking has contributed to such diverse fields as phenomenology, existentialism, hermeneutics, political theory, psychology, theology and post-structuralism. His main concern was ontology or the study of being. In his fundamental treatise, Being and Time, he attempted to access being or seeing by means of phenomenological analysis of human existence or Dasein in respect to its temporal and historical character. Heidegger made an attempt to approach phenomenology in a different way. He was not satisfied with the phenomenological approach adopted by Husserl. As we had already seen, the central problem for Husserl is the problem of constitution. How is the world as phenomenon constituted in our consciousness? Heidegger brings the Husserlian problem one step further. Instead of asking how something must be given in consciousness in order to be constituted, he asks what is the mode of being of that being in which the world constitutes itself. The meaning of this question is deeper in philosophical sense. Here, Heidegger tries to pose the idea that the subject-object relation in Husserl's phenomenology does not address all the layers of human experience accessible to consciousness. In order to understand the significance of this Heideggerian position, we should closely watch once again Husserl's phenomenological approach. Generally, we can say that by phenomenology, Husserl had always meant the science of consciousness and its objects. Following the Cartesian tradition, he saw the ground and the absolute starting point of philosophy in the subject. The procedure of bracketing is essential to Husserl's phenomenological reduction. The methodological procedure by which we are led by the natural attitude in which we are involved in the actual world and its affairs to the phenomenological attitude in which the analysis and detached description of the content of consciousness is possible. The phenomenological reduction helps us to free ourselves from prejudices and secure the purity of our detachment as observers, so that we can encounter things as they are in themselves independently of any presuppositions. The goal of phenomenology for Husserl is then a descriptive, detached analysis of consciousness in which objects as its correlates are constituted. It is this position of Husserl that Heidegger begins to question. What right does Husserl have to insist that the original mode of encounter with beings in which they appear to us as they are as things in themselves is the encounter of consciousness purified by phenomenological reduction and its objects? Whence and how it determined what is must be experienced as the things themselves in accordance with the principle of phenomenology. These are some of the questions which Heidegger either might have or had asked. Heidegger gives attention to many different modes in which we exist and encounter things. He analyzes the structures constitutive of things not only as they are encountered in the detached theoretical attitude of consciousness as it is proposed by Husserl, but also in daily life as utensils or in special moods, especially in anxiety. Also, he exhibits the structures that are constitutive of the particular kind of being which is the human being and which he calls Dasein. For Heidegger, it is not pure consciousness in which beings are originally constituted. The starting point of philosophy for him is not consciousness, but Dasein, the being for whom being is a question in its being. He asserts that the question of Dasein's being cannot be evaded as far as the problem of constitution is concerned. Dasein is that being in which any being is constituted. Further, the question of Dasein's being directs him to the problem of being in general. Heidegger states that the universal problem of being refers to that which constitutes and to that which is constituted. Hence, far from being dependent upon Husserl, Heidegger finds in his thought an inspiration leading him to the theme which continues to draw his attention from his early years, the question of the meaning of being. Phenomenology receives thus in Heidegger a new meaning. According to him, phenomenology is the way of access to what is to become the theme of ontology. Being is to be grasped by the means of the phenomenological method. However, being is always the being of a being, and accordingly it becomes accessible only indirectly through some existing entity. Therefore, phenomenological reduction is necessary. One must direct oneself towards an entity, but in such a way that its being is thereby brought out. It is Dasein which Heidegger chooses as the particular entity to access being. Hence, as the basic component of his phenomenology, Heidegger adopts the Husserlian phenomenological reduction, but gives it a completely different meaning. Heidegger does not base his philosophy on consciousness as Husserl did. For him, the phenomenological or theoretical attitude of consciousness, which Husserl makes the core of his doctrine, is only one possible mode of that which is more fundamental, namely Dasein's being. Although he agrees with Husserl that the transcendental constitution of the world cannot be unveiled by naturalistic or physical explanations, in his view, it is not a descriptive analysis of consciousness that leads to this end, but the analysis of Dasein. Phenomenology for him is not a descriptive detached analysis of consciousness. It is a method of access to being. For the Heidegger of being and time, philosophy is phenomenological ontology which takes its departure from the analysis of Dasein. In order to understand Heidegger's phenomenological approach, we have to know the meaning of the word hermeneutic phenomenology. Hermeneutics is theory of interpretation. This word is from the Greek root hermenia, means to interpret. According to Heidegger, the experiences of the world accessible to Dasein are interpretations in their mode of presentation. Every experience is not simply an is, rather an as to Dasein. Every experience is a possibility of being which is interpreted by Dasein. These possibilities are unfolded in time. The notion of temporality is an important theme in Heidegger. We shall come to it in our other lesson or lecture. Here, for the time being, we should remember that the possibilities of being and their interpretations by Dasein come to the halt by the possibility of impossibility. Heidegger calls this situation as the encounter of Dasein with death, which is a singular moment that defeats the temporal interpretations of Dasein. According to Heidegger, thus, Dasein is a subject that makes relation with the objects which are interpreted by it. Dasein is the existence that always steps aside to interpret the entities of the world. In Heidegger, Thus, phenomenology becomes ontology, the study of being of entities and being in general. Now, let us summarize. Phenomenology is one of the strong currents of thought in the 20th century. As a philosophical method, phenomenology proposes the following idea. Philosophy, which is defined as the knowledge of what is, must pursue its goal by methodological reflection on how our knowledge is constituted. In this sense, phenomenology claims to be a radical way of doing philosophy, a practice rather than a system. Negatively speaking, phenomenology tends to oppose the acceptance of unobservable matters and grand systems erected in speculative thinking. Furthermore, they tend to oppose naturalism, the worldview generalized from modern natural science and technology that has been spreading from Northern Europe since the Renaissance. Phenomenology is best understood as a radical anti-traditional style of philosophizing which emphasizes the attempt to get to the truth of matters, to describe phenomena that are appearances in the broadest sense as whatever appears in the manner in which it appears, that is, as it manifests itself to consciousness to the one who experiences. An appearance in phenomenological terms is not simply disorganized sense data or an undetermined object of experience. For phenomenology, any object which appears is already in a relation to consciousness. There is no gap to be filled up between them. The appearance of an object or of objectivity as such has no meaning outside of this relationship. In this sense, phenomenology tries to lay bare the relation between being and reason. By exploring the relation between being and thinking, phenomenology makes a thorough exploration of the mystery of the subjectivity and the question of the constitution of objectivity. Phenomenology seeks how consciousness attains to objective knowledge. Generally speaking, to phenomenology, consciousness is the condition of all experience. Thus, one can characterize an appearance as anything that shows itself for consciousness. As such, phenomenology's first step is to seek to avoid all misconstructions and impositions placed on experience in advance, whether these are drawn from religious or cultural traditions, from everyday common sense or from science itself. Explanations are not to be imposed before the phenomena have been understood from within. Phenomenology rejects the traditional representationalist account on knowledge which in general explained knowledge in terms of an inner mental representation or copy of what exists outside the mind. Phenomenology claims that our experience properly described must acknowledge that it presents itself as the experience of engaging directly with the world. According to its position, any philosophical account of knowledge has to remain faithful to the deepest experiential evidence. There are a few assignments for you to work out. 1. Discuss the new approach of phenomenology as a practice of philosophy rather than a system of philosophy. 2. Read carefully the article by Martin Heidegger, My Way to Phenomenology. 3. Try to phenomenologically analyze a cultural or religious experience in your life. 4. How can you do philosophy about the experiences of your life in the light of phenomenology? Discuss this question with your teachers and colleagues. I can suggest some book also for your further reference. 1. Edmund Husserl by Dermot Moran, Polity Press, 2005. 2. Martin Heidegger's Being and Time by John McCurry and Edward Robinson, Basil Blackwell, 1985. 3. Seppo Sajma and Matty Cambin, A Historical Introduction to Phenomenology, Croom Helen, 1987. 4. M. K. Badra, A Critical Survey of Phenomenology and Existentialism, ICPR, Delhi, 1990. 5. Herbert Spielberg, The Phenomenological Movement, A Historical Introduction, Volume 1, Martinus Nijhoff, 1965. 6. Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Martin Heidegger, Standard Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Thank you for watching this session. We will meet in another session with another topic. Till then, bye.